this is a topic that is something that's top of mind, I think, for a lot of smaller developers. It's unfortunately not the sexiest topic to present about, but hopefully people will find it very useful. So this is something I presented about for an hour, but we're getting kind of the abbreviated 15-minute version. Yeah, I mean, myself, I'm a consultant. I work with companies of all sizes in gaming space around business topics, including partnerships. If you want to learn more about that, come find me later. So basically, the impetus for this session, I've talked on this before at other conferences, is traditionally like when we have this sort of like developer publisher discussion, it turns into, these usually it's like three sort of types. It's like developers tirade or ranting about why they hate publishers, publishers talking about how like you have to work with them, or you have a panel with both, and then it just becomes like an argument sort of back and forth. So the goal of this is to actually provide sort of like very specific actionable insights that I've learned from basically working on behalf of smaller developers to find them partners for their mobile games. For 20 plus studios, talking to literally way too many different companies looking to publish content. So basically we'll kind of just touch on sort of the end-to-end process from deciding like, when do I talk to a publisher, what do I do before I talk to them, what do I need to provide, how do I engage with them, and then some tips around like once you've sort of moved along to the contract stage, agreement stage, like what are some things that you need to really be thinking about from that sort of business term perspective. So the sort of initial kind of thinking is basically like around thinking about the context for like partnerships in terms of development stages. So if you think about basically sort of the different sort of phases of sort of development, you have like phase 1, which is like paper concept. You have phase 2, which is a kind of like prototype alpha build. And phase 3, which is basically a beta build with maybe some KPIs, something that someone can actually play. So the reality is with basically sort of paper concepts, pitch documents, like unless you have, you're basically pitching at these to secure funding for your project. The reality is like most partners in the market don't really offer funding for a mobile game at any stage, especially if you don't have a working prototype. So basically, like I think for most of the folks in the audience that are smaller, you need to be thinking about definitely moving to at least the prototype stage. Exceptions, obviously, if you're a top grossing developer, that you had significant success in the market, essentially you might have a chance of securing funding if you have come from a larger studio, et cetera, stuff like that. So in terms of prototype, basically, just realizing this is actually not the right version of my presentation, but we will just work with it. So in terms of prototype, basically for right time developers, basically folks need to, or people who have some experience in mobile segment, like this isn't your first game, have strong team experience in the industry in general. The beauty of the prototype is like basically allow developers to see the concept coming to life, understand your vision for the game. But the reality is you also need to have like a pretty detailed documentation that provides more insight around the missing features, the monetization strategy. That's going to be really important to have accompanying your prototype. In terms of like the third phase, beta build, I mean, at this phase basically is where sort of I think the reality of the market that stands right now, you are going to have to get to this point, which is becoming more and more difficult. So again, beta build has nearly all the key features, including monetization. Ideally, you have potentially maybe tested it in the market. You have some users. You can show some data. Again, this is from the perspective of like free-to-play experience. So I think most teams with minimal sort of mobile experience will definitely need to reach these stage before you really have any chance of getting interest from potential partner, just because of the competitiveness in the market. The pure reality is like the probability of any game being successful financially these days is very, very low. So again, partners are looking to de-risk these situations. So yeah, in terms of like this phase, I think ideally you want to have some soft launch KPIs. You might go to a partner and be like, hey, here's my prototype, here's my beta build, and they're going to say, cool, looks great, come back to me when you have some data. This is something that you'll see if you have a lot of discussions in the market right now. This is especially true in like crowded genres where you have super saturated games. Super saturation like match 3, strategy, social strategy game, runners, stuff like that. You know, basically partners are going to see like, why is this differentiated in the market? Why does this have a chance to stand out in the market? So in terms of like you've sort of thinking about when to start during the phase, the next step is like, what do I need to have to actually go and engage with different companies? So in terms of like my sort of essential checklist of materials, I think something really critical is like this sort of short and catchy blurb about your game. So highlighting like, why is your game differentiated? Why will it delight users? But also, why will it make money, right? Because the reality is this is a business at the bottom line, and if your product doesn't have a chance commercially in the market, you're going to have a lot of challenges. So this is just an example of a game that I worked on, conveying like a lot of information in a very short amount of space, and this is something that I'll touch on a bit in this section. So in terms of like materials that I think are essential, you have to have these when you reach out to a partner. Company presentation, information about your previous projects, ideally specific commercial performance metrics, information about your team and their experience, and then in terms of the game presentation, key differentiating game features, well thought out monetization strategy, screenshots, and any early metrics. I'll talk about the gameplay video later on. I believe it's in this version of the presentation. But you basically, the video to me is like actually one of the most important things, because one of the things you'll find out quickly is that folks reviewing games are looking at so many things so quickly that if you can have a video, that's probably maybe the first and only thing they'll look at. So in terms of materials, you want to keep it short. Brevity is incredibly important. I realize you're, very creatively focused, very passionate, but the reality is, I see all the time these like 50-page, presentations on a game. Like no partner is ever going to look at that until they're, at the latest stages of discussion. So I advise like these smaller studios, condense this thing down. I have my format down to like 2 pages. And that's like where you need to be. This is something, again, very tactical, but you need to like manage like file sizes, keep things very small. Maybe you're working with companies in other countries. I sometimes see these like, they're like, oh, check out the game video, and it's like 500 megabyte, download from somewhere, and it takes forever. And basically, you start downloading and you forget about it, you never come back. Use the cloud services, be cognizant of, especially international stuff, hosting things on Google and sending it to somebody in China. They'll never be able to see it because it's blocked. But leverage the cloud because people will forward things along internally. And so if you kind of have one link to everything on your studio and your game, it's much more efficient. Because if someone's like, I'm going to look at this, and they're not there, they're not going to probably come back. Keeping it relevant. So in terms of the gameplay video, this isn't a trailer. This is actual gameplay footage. Keep it short. Show the most sort of compelling parts of gameplay. Edit it, time compress it, so maybe it's accelerated in terms of the speed. Get it down to a minute. I find that a lot of times this is the first and only thing that folks are looking at. So in terms of potential partners, basically, this is pretty straightforward in terms of like different sourcing options. But again, industry blogs, publications, conferences and events, you can get names of companies. Again, look at App Store rankings, looking at companies, who's a publisher, and then leverage your network. So I think as a starting point, I recommend starting from like 30 to 50 companies, which seems insane, but the reality is you're going to start filtering them down. You can look at something like genre. I have an RPG game. Is this company only doing casual games? Then it's probably not super relevant for a discussion. It's not a very good fit. You don't want to force a fit in these discussions. Obviously, previous performance. You can use free stuff like App Annie to see the rankings. And see kind of like, what previous performance these companies have had. They might say one thing, but this is reality, and this is sort of the past performance. So it's something that you can definitely look at. So in terms of like next steps, that you basically figure out if you're ready to talk to a publisher, put together your materials. Now you're engaging, and hopefully there's some interest. Now you're starting to think about business terms. Again, something that a lot of developers have no interest in sort of spending time on, but is critically important. Again, it's just like the sort of legal topic as well. You want to set yourself up for success. So operating system rights. So when you sign a deal, you want to be very careful about what rights you give away. So we'll talk about operating system rights. So, again, if a partner doesn't have a plan to release your game on a specific platform, that's sort of a red flag. If they're like, oh, I want rights for all platforms. Well, what are you going to do on Steam? What are you going to do on Android? What are you going to do on some other platforms? This is important if you look at situations like China, where you basically have the third-party ecosystem. If you just give someone the rights for Android, then somebody controls those, and you've effectively given away that opportunity. Again, geographic rights. Same thing. If someone doesn't have a specific strategy to execute and release your game in Asia or in certain specific markets, you definitely don't want to just be like, sure, global rights, no problem. Like, you want to make sure they have an actual plan. Because if your game is successful in the Western market, you want to have the ability to look at opportunities in international markets, which are quite significant these days. So in other important terms is like marketing and promotional guarantee. Basically, you want to push for basically some type of marketing commitment, either based on installs or marketing spend. You want to make sure to have as specific terms as possible. You're going to do this many installs by like this many days after launch. You want to leave no room for discussion, be able to have it be as quantified as possible, so there's no issues there. And in terms of like marketing recoupment, this can be a huge issue for a smaller studio, because in mobile these days, especially obviously free to play, the budgets are heavily front loaded, and so what happens is they spend a ton of money, and if they recoup all that marketing dollars, you're never going to see a dollar for 2, 3, 4 months. So push to have some type of recoupment that's maybe really small. Maybe it's like you get 10% or 20% until they recoup their marketing. Because otherwise, your cash flow, you're going to be doing live operations for the games, and you're not going to have any money coming in. Yikes. So advanced payments, again, you want to push for like a reduced revenue share, where you're at least getting 10 to 20%. So in a project financing situation where someone's fully funding your project, you want to make sure that you're getting advanced payments, or you want to getting some like small revenue share to keep your cash flow going. You also want to make sure your advanced payments are structured into very specific milestones, like we're going to get 1/3 when we sign the agreement. We're going to get 1/3 when the game launches for beta. What does that mean? It basically means that it is live in the App Store in at least one country or something. Again, very specific, so there's no room for debate. Another important topic is like IP ownership. So again, the previous presentation touched on the importance of this too. Is I see deals where like someone's like blah blah blah, and then like the last clause is like we control the IP for your game for like all possible things you could ever imagine, effectively. So you can imagine in a situation where Angry Birds was actually a game that was published by Chilingo. If they had a deal or a clause that was like, oh yeah, and we also own some perpetual royalty on this IP. I mean, that would be a huge financial impact to the company. So never give away, IP ownership unless, again, there's a specific plan to execute on it from your partner. I'm just skipping around a little bit because, again, so the reality is like sometimes things don't work out, and I think this is something that folks need to be cognizant of. So developers' worst nightmare, and this happens unfortunately quite often, is someone signs a game, a partner signs a game, they launch the game, they do some promotion, there's sort of no traction, and they move on to some other project. So in this scenario, you want to basically set yourself up to have kind of like a some type of escape hatch. So I think usually my recommendation is adding some type of minimum ongoing sort of clause in terms of like the requirements. Like, hey, if the game doesn't have at least X daily active users over like 3 months, we can terminate the agreement. We can get the rights to the game back. If the game is feature complete and you take X months to launch the game and you don't, we can get the game back, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you just want to have the ability to terminate and not be locked into something, especially these days where it's focusing on fewer projects. You don't want them tied up. So yeah, I think this is something that seems pretty obvious, but I see this all the time, is like you talk to somebody at this publisher and they're like, oh yeah, like, we're gonna do 1 million installs or whatever. We've done that for these other games. You get the agreement. It says, you're like, why isn't there any marketing commitment in here? And they say, oh, well, we've done a lot of, published all these games, and you can see all the installs. Don't worry about it, no problem. So, and then the game actually comes out, and they don't do what has been discussed previously. And so, again, you want to basically get everything in writing. The other reality is that, in the industry is like people come and go, right? So you might have had a very trusted contact at your publisher, and they leave to go somewhere else. And then, suddenly you don't have a very good advocate internally in terms of, internal sort of jockeying for promotion and things like that. All right, so the last couple of things. Again, I think I've talked about this already a little bit, but you definitely want to quantify everything as much as possible in your agreements. You end up with kind of some of these like legalese, if you will, that's like, what is reasonable? There's, say some generic language like, reasonable promotion, reasonable effort, again, like I think when publishers are sending these agreements to developers, they're actually expecting them to make a lot of changes, but a lot of people don't for whatever reason. So again, it's worth investing the time. It's worth investing getting professional feedback, because again, you want to set yourself up for long-term success. And some of these really minor details that are incredibly dull and boring can sort of crush your business in the long term. And there's plenty of people that you can talk to that this has happened to. So it's definitely worth, even if you can't afford like formal like legal advice, talk to other developers that have them review your agreement, get their feedback, et cetera, et cetera. So that's actually it. I apologize for the presentation. This is definitely the early beta version, but I've covered many of the topics, and we actually have a couple minutes. So I'll be around to answer questions. I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have right now as well, though.
Questions for Josh? He's running through a lot of stuff about publishing there and partners. No? Okay, well, you can go. Oh, there's a question there. There's a question that you pass the man a mic, please.
From the publisher side, we're just getting started with that. What would you recommend for us to be looking out for when either attracting some really good client developers? Yeah.
So just in terms of gaining interest in working with you?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think offering like some very specific business terms as sort of like something you can very much commit to, especially early on. If you don't have a strong reputation, it's something that will attract a lot of interest. Coming out and saying like, hey, we're publishing games, so is like many other people. So saying, I think you can offer like some specific marketing commitment or, resources plus some financial commitment, either marketing or, offset funding. That's a good way to get a lot of inbound interest. There's other more complicated ways to get a lot of inbound interest. It's actually not that hard, but that's just some very high level thoughts.
Thanks.
Cool.
Excellent.
All right,
Thank you
thanks,
very
everyone.
much, Josh.